And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is July the 13th, 194th day of the year. Just 171 days remain the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. Well, it is National Beans and Franks Day. Embrace your geekiness day. And Gruntled Workers Day. Celebrate loving your job. If you do. Now, this date in 1787, Continental Congress enacted the Northwest Ordinance, established the rules for settling new territories and limiting the expansion of slavery. And in 1930, we saw the very first World Cup soccer matches played in Montevideo, Uruguay. U.S. beat Belgium 3-0. France defeated Mexico 4-1. And the World Cup's still going on. So that's quite almost 100 years. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news, because there's always something going on. The old curse, may you live in interesting times, certainly applies. Well, for those that haven't been following the news, longtime GOP Senator Lindsey Graham died at age 71 after a brief and sudden illness. I've heard a number of interesting stories. In fact, one of them said he was murdered. Well, Graham represented South Carolina in the U.S. Senate since 2003. Previously served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. Longtime member of the Senate Judiciary and Armed Services Committees. Served in the U.S. Air Force and Air Force Reserve, retiring as a colonel after a 33-year career. Senate Majority Leader John Thune called Graham a trusted advisor and colleague, and said his influence be felt for generations to come. The D.C. medical examiners released preliminary findings over about his death. According to the medical examiner, the preliminary examination found he suffered from an aortic dissection due to a arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Medical examiner said the death certificate remained pending until toxicology and microscopic testing are finalized. It's interesting to note, he is the second, shall we say, unexplained death in Congress. Well, a heart condition tied to Lindsey Graham's death can strike without warning. And there's medical authorities have released several things you should be looking at. New details surrounding Graham's sudden death have drawn attention to a cardiovascular emergency that can become fatal within minutes. A statement released by Graham's office on Sunday cited preliminary findings from the D.C. Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, identifying the cause of death as an aortic dissection due to arteriosclerotic and cardiovascular disease. Authorities said Graham was transported to George Washington University Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 10:23 p.m. on Saturday. Autopsy was done on Sunday. Well, America's retirement system is broken, and President Trump may have found a bold fix. President Trump told reporters last week he was looking very strongly at Australia's retirement system. Most Americans shrugged and thought, great, another retirement plan. Now, this idea becomes legislation, could represent the biggest shift in American retirement policy since Social Security was signed into law in 1935. Don't be surprised if President Trump's name is on the retirement account if it happens. Important thing to understand is this is the main point. President Trump isn't talking about copying Australia. He's talking about taking what works and making it sharper for America. So you might ask what it is he's trying to accomplish. Well, the Our retirement system was built for an economy that barely exists anymore. People used to work for one employer for 30 years, get a pension, collect Social Security, and then retire. Social Security was built for people who claimed it at 65 and lived to about 70. Well, that's no longer the case. People are lucky if they work at the same company for 5 years, much less 30. Pensions are nearly gone. And we know the savings rate in America is an abysmal 2.6%. Today, Americans change job every few years. Millions work as freelancers and independent contractors and Uber drivers, or for employers that don't even offer a 401k. Meanwhile, too many workers have little or nothing saved for retirement, and that's the backdrop for President Trump's comments. Australia, on the other hand, requires employers to contribute a percentage of an employee's wages to an individual retirement account known as a super. Worker owns the account, the investments stay invested, the account follows employees from job to job. And the result is Australia has built one of the world's largest retirement saving pools relative to the size of its population. There's a constant flow of capital into the markets, and President Trump likes the thought of that. Isn't an accident. It's a result of automatic long-term investing. And he's looking at something like that for the American economy. Well, Caitlin Clark being compared to Paige Buchers. A lot of talk about how two white WNBA stars wound up with vastly different cultural perceptions. Debate over Caitlin Clark and Paige Buchers broke out on social media past the week after former NFL wide receiver Harry Douglas claimed on ESPN that everything we expected Caitlin Clark to be, Paige Buchers has been in the WNBA. Clark is often at the center of mainstream cultural discussions over her status as the preeminent player in the WNBA, while also being Caucasian. But Buchers, despite being Caucasian and dominant in the sport, has appeared to dodge that same degree of social debate as Clark from the media and from fans. So how did these two white women end up with such different reputations? Well, on the surface, their childhoods had some similarities. Both Clark and Buchers grew up in the American Midwest with basketball at the center of their lives. Clark hailing from Indiana and Bucher from Minnesota. But beneath the surface, their upbringing was fundamentally different. Clark came up in a traditional American nuclear family in Des Moines, Iowa, with a family history defined by sports, as her grandfather was a locally famous high school basketball coach. Grew up competing with their two older brothers in the backyard, while their father, who coached her early on, famously refused to let her shoot three-pointers as a child to ensure her physical shooting form was structurally perfect before expanding her range. It was a vastly different story for Buchers from Minnesota. Her parents divorced when she was 3, raised primarily by her father while navigating a split household dynamic after her mother eventually remarried and moved to Montana. Grew up in a blended family with 3 half-siblings, including a younger brother, Drew, who's biracial and partially black. Since elementary school, she's been close friends with future NBA lottery pick Jalen Suggs, who navigated the Minneapolis St. Paul youth basketball scene. And Buchers joined the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd. Clark stayed out of politics and led Team USA to gold. Well, U.S.-Iran exchange fires. Republican Guard claims the Strait of Hormuz closure until the end of interference. That's like the mouse dictating to the elephant. The Iranian war escalated again as U.S. forces hit about 140 Iranian military targets, bringing CENTCOM's 3-night total to more than 309 targets. Iran's Republican Guard claims to keep striking to the end of U.S. interference in this region. Strait of Hormuz remains the flashpoint, with Tehran claiming it's closed, while U.S. officials and maritime authorities say commercial traffic is still moving. Iranian attacks have also widened across the Middle East, targeting or threatening sites tied to Jordan and Kuwait and Oman and Qatar and UAE and Bahrain. Well, be interesting to note if the Republican Guard ever comes back to reality. Sometimes you can be beaten and not know it or not admit it. Well, New Zealand actor Sam Neill has died at age 78 after recovering from cancer, his family says. Died suddenly on Monday after he recovered from cancer. He was surrounded by his family when he passed away. His family said in the statement shared on Neil's Instagram page, it's with immense sadness that Sam Neill shared the news of his passing on Monday, July 13th in Sydney, Australia. The loss was sudden and unexpected, but blessed by the fact that he remained cancer-free. Passed with a dignity that had been characterized his entire life, his family said. If you remember, he was a star in Jurassic Park. And he announced in April he was cancer-free after undergoing a treatment for stage 3 blood cancer. Well, you could say it's almost a end of an era. So many actors and actresses and political figures are dying recently. Well, a naked man tried to kidnap a 7-year-old tourist from its mother at Portland Park. Bystanders had to intervene. According to the story, a naked man was arrested over the weekend in Portland, Oregon, after he allegedly attempted to kidnap a 7-year-old girl from her mother at a waterfront park. Shortly before 7 p.m. on Saturday, Portland police got reports of a naked man running around Tom McCall Waterfront Park. One of the callers saying the man had attempted to punch him in the head. The police said all the officers were busy responding to other calls and weren't available at the time. About 12 minutes later, another caller reported that the suspect had grabbed a young girl and tried to pull her away from her mother. At that point, officers responded to the scene and found the nude suspect swimming nearby in the Willamette River. Suspect was identified as 31-year-old Daniel Vassy. He was arrested and booked into the Multnomah County Detention Center on charges of first and second degree attempted kidnapping, first degree custodial interference, and third degree assault and harassment. Police said the 7-year-old girl wasn't seriously injured. She was checked by paramedics at the scene and treated for scratches, but wasn't transported by ambulance to the hospital. An investigation revealed that Vassy allegedly grabbed the girl's arm, and her parents and bystanders stepped in to prevent him from taking her. The girl's mother grabbed her other arm and tried to prevent Vassy from taking her daughter, and the struggle over the girl was so significant she was actually lifted up off the ground. Well, it takes all kinds to make a world. Joe Rogan calls out crazy kick attempt by Conor McGregor that led to injury. He said, you just don't do that. Conor McGregor couldn't believe his 5-year return to the octagon ended the way it did on Saturday night in UFC 329 against Max Holloway. Rogan said it was a crazy move that he tried in the opening round that cost him. Crazy move, he tried a jumping roundhouse kick, Rogan said during the UFC broadcast after the main event ended. If you don't land in a good way and with a supporting way, you put so much pressure on that knee. He landed on his knee in the worst position. McGregor's kick attempt clearly hurt him as he immediately grabbed his knee after Holloway evaded the strike. McGregor tried to keep fighting, but referee Mike Beltran called the fight after he tried another kick and clearly couldn't land properly. According to Rogan, he blew his ACL out with that very first move that he did. It sucks, but it's just, frankly, you just don't do that. Well, I know I can sympathize with knee issues. Mookie Betts becomes the latest Dodger player to skip the White House visit, insists it's not political. Los Angeles Dodgers organization's most successful current franchise on the field, most successful at finding ways to put themselves in the center of controversy. Now, all because we're in a constant tug of war between making left-wing fans and sports writers happy and remaining apolitical because they are actually a baseball team. When they won the 2024 World Series, they faced a firestorm of criticism from left-wing sports writers and some extreme fans for accepting President Trump's invitation to visit the White House. Well, that continued almost immediately after LA won the 2025 title, too, with pro-immigration groups like the National Day Labor Organization Network asking the Dodgers, a baseball team, to stand on the right side of history. Writers from the Los Angeles Times are equally absurd, saying all in all, it's hard to imagine the Dodgers agreeing to a celebratory photo op with the president right now. Los Angeles is not just Dodger blue, but Democrat blue. It's a sport, people. It's a game. Politics should have nothing to do with it. But unfortunately, the left wants to make everything about politics. Well, Matt Damon was pushed to the limit while filming The Odyssey. He details the grueling physical discomforts. After more than 30 years in Hollywood and roughly 80 films under his belt, he says no role has tested him quite like Christopher Nolan's upcoming epic, The Odyssey. Doing an appearance on Sunday Sit Down with Will Geist, the Academy Award winner, who's 55, opened up about the grueling physical demands of playing Odysseus, the legendary king of Ithaca, admitting the ambitious production pushed both the cast and the crew to their limits. He said this movie's going to be hard. And when he was chosen for the role, and he said, I looked at him like I made, 80 movies. He recalled of one of his early conversations with Nolan, and Nolan said, no, this movie's going to be really hard. And to his credit, he wasn't lying, according to Damon. Well, Mitch McConnell breaks his silence on the mystery hospitalization after Graham's death. Representative Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, after a month being hospitalized, revealed what actually happened to cause his absence from the Senate. I'd heard from several sources he was actually dead as well. In a lengthy statement released Sunday evening, McConnell attributed his childhood fight with polio to a fall he suffered last month, which landed him in the hospital. He was briefly unconscious, he said in an open letter to Kentuckians, and while recovering was hit with a mild case of pneumonia. He said his doctors have confirmed that he didn't break any bones or suffer a concussion. He said he didn't have a heart attack or a stroke, didn't have any tumors or hemorrhages. Yet the question of when he's going to return to the Senate is still a mystery, something McConnell himself acknowledged. Says, as much as it frustrates me, this process takes time, and on the advice of my doctors, I won't be able to return to the Senate floor to vote quite yet. But rest assured, in the meantime, I'm not taking a break from the Senate business that matters to you. And his attending physician noted that McConnell has experienced several falls throughout the year that may have been attributed to his post-polio condition. Well, illegal immigrant truckers accused of mowing down American families has ignited fury over loopholes, unleashing deadly roads. Commercial truck driver charged in the death of a Pennsylvania State Police trooper, and the latest in a string of illegal immigration truck drivers accused in deadly crashes. It's one of a series of cases that have intensified scrutiny of commercial driver's license issued to non-citizens and prompted a federal trucking crackdown. Authorities allege that Michael Bond, a Haitian national living in Brockton, Massachusetts, left Interstate 81 in Silicon County on July 1st and struck a marked Pennsylvania State Police patrol vehicle during a roadside commercial vehicle inspection before hitting Pennsylvania State Trooper Michael Pahira, who's 44. Bond's semi-truck and the truck being inspected both caught fire, and Pahira later died in the local hospital. Bond is later charged with homicide by vehicle, involuntary manslaughter, reckless driving, and 6 additional lesser charges. Fox News previously reported Bond entered the U.S. under the Biden administration humanitarian parole program in July 2024. The Department of Homeland Security terminated his parole and ordered him removed in June of 2025 after denying his application for temporary protected status. But in spite of that, he remained in the country. Living in Massachusetts, he got a non-domiciled commercial driver's license that was renewed before the Trump administration banned states from issuing or renewing those licenses for ineligible drivers. So once again, some of the Biden administration policies have caused another death. Well, Generation Z breaks the ultimate taboo by posting salaries online. Wall Street Journal editor says high living costs and labor market uncertainty are pushing personal finance into public view. It's been a deeply rooted social taboo that folks just don't discuss salaries, spending limits, and personal finances online. Wall Street Journal's Free Expression associate editor, Mary Julia Koch, joined Fox Business Ashley Webster on Varney and Company to discuss loud budgeting and why younger Americans are increasingly willing to make one's private financial information public. Well, I've seen a lot of folks revealing things online that I never would reveal. Well, San Jose State University refuses to provide public records related to investigation of allegations against volleyball coach. The university says it won't disclose any emails related to an investigation into graphic allegations against volleyball coach Todd Kress that the university was informed of in October 2024. The university hadn't issued any public statement addressing the allegations at the time of the publication. Fox News submitted a public records request to the university seeking emails related to an investigation of those allegations, but that request was denied. The university conducted a reasonable search for these records under California Government Code Section 7922.535 and has determined requested records are not disclosable in the Public Records Act. Well, we'll see what comes of it. The allegations against Kress was made by one of his former players at Fairfield University in 1998. Was sent to San Jose State University October 24, 2024, while the volleyball team was embroiled in a season overshadowed by national controversy over the presence of a trans athlete on the team. Well, on that note, our last show talked about Timeslips. And there's been a lot of stories about strange things happening in regard to time. In fact, I remember the story I want to start out with was actually the basis of a Rod Serling Twilight Zone episode. And I've talked to several people who swear this particular story is actually true. It came out of Scotland. The year was 1939. Britain at that time was bracing itself for war with Germany. Young Royal Air Force pilot stationed in Scotland took off on his aircraft on a routine reconnaissance flight over the Highlands. Mists were curling around the hills and the valleys like getting ready for a swirling storm. Low on fuel and disoriented by heavy cloud cover, he looked for a place to land and to his astonishment saw a vast airfield laid out below him. Its runways long and gleaming, marked with bright lights that guided him like a beacon. Taxiways stretched in perfect order. Hangars stood neatly in line, and ground crews in blue uniforms appeared to wave signals from the tarmac. Their movements, he said later, were practiced and precise. Well, of course, he was relieved beyond words, so he descended and touched down smoothly, feeling the wheels of his aircraft grip the tarmac. And for a brief moment, he saw fuel trucks and mechanics approaching his aircraft as though to help him out. But as he slowed and turned to taxi, the entire scene shimmered, dissolved before his eyes, leaving him skidding to a halt, not on a runway, but in the middle of an empty moorland. The rough grass flattened beneath his plane's weight. No lights, no hangars, no ground crews, only the wind-slipped heather and the lonely sound of his own engine sputtering in the silence. Well, as you might guess, he was startled and shaken. But in spite of that, he managed to take off again and return to his own base, where he recounted that bizarre incident to his superiors. And of course, at first, his story was dismissed as exhaustion or nerves, but a number of years later, after the war, he learned with a chill that on that very stretch of land, a large modern airport was built. Layout, runways, and hangars matched exactly what he had described in 1939, long before a single blueprint had been drawn. Well, as you might guess, the memory of that encounter haunted him until he died. Lingering question of whether he had stumbled through time itself or caught a glimpse of the future etched into the Scottish Highland. Now, this next story comes from England. The year is 1953. It was a damp autumn evening near the ancient city of York. A woman named Harry Martindale was working as a young apprentice plumber in the cellar of the treasurer's house, an old building with a history stretching back centuries. I said woman, it was actually a young man. Suddenly heard the faint rhythmic sound of marching echoing through the stone walls. That was certainly a noise utterly out of place with the still surroundings where he was working. First he thought it might be construction going on outside, but from the dimness of that old cellar passage, figures began to emerge. Row after row of Roman soldiers, spectral but startlingly vivid, their faces grim, their leather tunics weathered, their shields battered from battles, and their short swords clinking against their sides. They marched in perfect unison, but what struck him most was that they appeared from the knees upward, though half buried beneath the modern floor. Then he realized with a shudder they were walking on the level of an ancient Roman road that had long since been covered up by layers of earth and history. The leader carried a standard, and though none of the soldiers looked at him, their presence, of course, was overwhelming, as if he were a ghost himself passing into their world rather than the other way around. And the air around him grew heavy, filled with the scent of damp leather and iron, and Martindale, frozen in terror, pressed against the wall, watching as they passed silently into the darkness and disappeared without a trace. At that point, as you might guess, he ran upstairs, pale and shaking. Few people believed until later excavations confirmed the existence of a Roman road running directly beneath the cellar, precisely where that phantom legion had marched. The experience left him marked for life, his vivid account never wavering. Remains one of the most famous and chilling tales of Timeslips through the cracks in England's haunted past. Well, from England, let's go to the U.S., because there's Timeslips here as well. This story comes from the 1920s. Now, it all began in the autumn of 1974. A young couple driving through the upstate New York took a wrong turn late at night. Seeing a grand old building lit up in the distance, decided to stop in hopes of finding directions or maybe even a place to stay. The structure actually looked like a lavish hotel or a country club, its windows glowing warmly against the chill of the evening. Inside, they heard the sounds of a jazz band playing lively tunes. Well, curiously, they stopped in and went inside and were immediately transported into what felt like another era. A vast ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers. Couples dressed in elegant gowns and tuxedos swirled across the floor. The air was alive with laughter and clinking glasses and the brassy swing of a live orchestra on the stage. Now, the couple, of course, who were dressed in casual 1970s clothing, felt terribly out of place, but oddly welcomed, as though they had been expected. Waiters in crisp white jackets passed with trays of champagne, and women wore beads and feathers in their hair, makeup perfectly in the style of the roaring 20s. And everything seemed real. The scent of perfume and the heat of bodies moving and the shimmer of the sequins catching the light. Until the young man noticed something strange. Nobody ever made direct contact with him. When he tried to speak to a guest, the man smiled faintly and turned away as though he hadn't heard. Well, as you might guess, the couple were somewhat uneasy. And as their unease grew, and when they finally decided to leave, they walked back through the heavy doors into the cool night and turned around to glance behind them. And to their astonishment, the building was now dark, its windows boarded up, and once grand facade decaying with ivy and rot as though it had been abandoned for decades. But they got back in their car, not knowing what to think, realized they'd somehow stumbled into a shimmering fragment of the 1920s. A ballroom caught up in time, and though they'd tell that story for years afterwards, nobody ever found a trace of that glittering party they claimed to have witnessed. Never found much history about that building as well. Well, that's from the U.S. Let's go to India. The year's 1912. We got a disappearing village. In the summer of 1912, a group of British railway officials traveling through the dense rural heat of India were making their way back along a dusty road after a long day of inspecting track. Well, dusk began to fall, and the jungle pressed close on either side, its human air alive with the cries of unseen creatures. And as the first stars began to emerge, they noticed a cluster of flickering lantern lights glowing in the distance along the low hills. Shimmering like fireflies gathered together, arranged in neat rows that suggested a village might be nestled there. Relieved at the prospect of finding food and rest, the men quickened their pace, listening for the telltale sound of habitation. Voices, dogs barking, the crackle of cooking fires. But everything remained curiously silent, as though the lights shone in a vacuum. The closer they drew, the stranger became. For though the lanterns burned steadily and bright, casting a golden aura that spread over the fields, there were no huts, no smoke, no movement of human life. And in this, just as they reached the edge of that rise where the village should have stood, the entire collection of lights dimmed and vanished in an instant, plunging the countryside into complete darkness, leaving only the rustling of tall grass and the endless course of insects. Well, as you might guess, they were confused and unsettled. The officials combed the air with lanterns of their own, but found nothing but open ground, as if that village had never existed. When they later questioned locals in the region, some shook their heads gravely and told old tales of a settlement that had once thrived there centuries before. It was eventually wiped out by disease and fire. But they heard reports about spirits that were said to still gather on certain nights, their ghostly dwellings appearing like beacons to travelers before melting back into the earth. The officials, who were hardened men not prone to superstition, never spoke openly of the incident in their reports, but among themselves they could never shake the eerie memory of that phantom village that shone so vividly against the Indian night, only to dissolve like a mirage into the shadows. Well, let's go to Egypt. The year is 1897. That year, an English antiquarian traveling through Egypt found himself wandering the outskirts of the great ruins near Saqqara, where the sand seemed to shift endlessly with the desert winds, and the heat shimmered like a living thing upon the horizon. Well, fascinated by the crumbling walls and half-buried temples, he strayed from his guides, drawn by a narrow passage that seemed recently exposed by the shifting dunes. Ducking inside, he entered a stone corridor whose air was strangely cool and heavy with the scent of incense, as though that place was still in use. As he moved deeper, the flickering light of torches replaced the sun, and the carved hieroglyphs on the walls glowed as if freshly painted. And suddenly he emerged into a vast hall alive with color and sound. Rows of priests in pristine white linen chanted in deep rhythmic voices, the golden amulets gleaming, while servants bustled about carrying trays of food and wine and exotic offerings. At the far end of the chamber sat a regal figure upon a gilded throne. That was the pharaoh himself, his cornel-lined eyes glazing with calm authority, surrounded by attendants, fanning with ostrich fans. The antiquarian froze, unable to comprehend how he had stepped from a ruin into what appeared to be a living court. Every detail was sharp and immediate. The rustle of linen, the metallic ring of bronze vessels, the scent of lotus flowers mingled with resin smoke. He was then noticed by a guard who pointed and barked something in a language he somehow understood, and in that instant panic overcame him. He stumbled backward, clutched the walls, and as he turned down the corridor, the chanting and torchlight faded, giving way once more to dust. silence and ruin. When he emerged back into the sunlight, he was shaken and disoriented. That past had seemed to be gone, buried again by the sand. Told his story only in private circles back in England, insisting with trembling conviction that he hadn't imagined it. For a brief and inexplicable moment, he had truly stood in the court of an ancient pharaoh, witnessing a world that should have been lost in time thousands of years ago. Well, there's been a number of stories about time slips like that. This next one is another story from a pilot. It was 1989, summer. Small private aircraft piloted by a businessman on a routine cross-country flight descended toward what he thought was a modern Midwestern airstrip for refueling. But as wheels touched the tarmac, he was struck by the eerie quiet that surrounded that runway. Stillness broken only by the low hum of his own engine. Expected to see the usual hangars and radio towers, but instead found himself taxiing past squat wooden buildings and faded control shacks and fuel trucks that looked like relics from another era. And the men that rushed out to guide him were dressed in coveralls and caps straight out of the 1930s. Their movements purposeful, oddly restrained, as though they were as surprised to see him as he was to see them. Air smelled faintly of oil and dust, and looked around and didn't see any gleaming jets or neon-lit signs on any biplanes and propeller-driven craft lying neatly along the field, their polished wings flashing in the sunlight. When he cut his engines and climbed out, the mechanics approached cautiously, their eyes fixed on his sleek modern aircraft with open astonishment, muttering in slang and accents that seemed plucked from half a century before. Uneasy, he asked for fuel, but their replies were curt and bewildered, as though they didn't recognize his plane's specifications. Realizing something was deeply wrong, he got back aboard again, started his engine, and taxied back down the runway, his heart pounding as the ground seemed to blur beneath him. The moment his wheels left the earth, the entire scene shimmered like heat rising from the asphalt. When he looked back, the wooden hangars and old-fashioned planes were gone, replaced by the concrete and steel of a modern airfield, buzzing with contemporary traffic. Well, he landed again, shaken and pale, to find radio contact restored and the world exactly as it should have been. But he couldn't erase the memory of that silent descent into the past, nor the bewildered faces of men who seemed for a fleeting moment to have witnessed a machine that shouldn't have existed in their time. Well, the story out of South Africa. The year is 1948. In that year, a young boy exploring the rocky veld near his village in South Africa wandered further than usual, followed the call of strange bird cries and the shimmer of sunlight on the narrow gorge. Well, he scrambled down into that ravine and found himself in a clearing unlike anything he'd ever seen. The air seemed heavy and strangely still, the landscape raw and untouched, as though he'd stepped into a world long before roads and fences or machines. Ahead of him, a group of figures emerged from the brush, tall, lean men and women with dark, painted skin and animal pelts draped over their shoulders, carrying stone-tipped spears and wooden clubs. Their hair was wild, their eyes were sharp and alert, and they moved with a grace that was both predatory and cautious. Well, the boy froze, of course, clutching a rock in his hand, but instead of attacking, the strange people regarded him with curiosity, speaking in gruntled tones he couldn't understand, their voices deep and primal. He noticed the fire smoldering behind him, the bones of hunted animals scattered around, the smell of roasted meat mixing with the earthy scent of clay and smoke. One of the hunters stepped closer and reached out as though to touch him. In that instant, the boy felt an overwhelming surge of fear. He stumbled backward, fell, and scrambled up the rocks, his heart pounding. Sounds of that gruntal language echoed behind him. When he reached the top of the ravine, the world shifted, the air grew lighter, the bird songs returned to normal. When he turned around, the clearing was empty, the fire gone, the people vanished as though they'd never been there. Well, breathless, he ran home and told his family, dismissed it as imagination. But the boy swore that he had stood face to face with people who belonged to another era, long before his time. The rest of his life, he carried that haunting certainty he had stumbled, however briefly, into the Stone Age. Well, from South Africa, let's go to Japan. Year's 1988. In that year, a salaryman in Tokyo, weary from the long day at work, descended into a familiar train station late at night, expecting the usual bustle of commuters, the rumble of steel wheels and the vendors calling out from their stalls. But when he reached the platform, he froze because the station transformed into something utterly alien and dazzlingly advanced. Walls shimmered with smooth panels of glowing light that pulsed like living glass. Sleek trains with silver bodies and seamless curves glided silently in and out, their doors opening without a sound. Instead of paper timetables and glittering flipboards, enormous floating displays hung in the air, projecting schedules and sharp, luminous characters that shifted as though alive. People moved all around him, but they were unlike the commuters he knew, dressed in clothing that was streamlined and unfamiliar, fabrics that seemed to ripple like water or shine like metal. Their briefcases were replaced by thin, glowing tablets that flickered with symbols he couldn't decipher. The air was unnaturally clean, humming faintly with some hidden energy. Its soft chimes announced arrivals in a language that was Japanese but tinged with strange inflections. He stood in shock as one of the futuristic trains stopped in front of him, its doors sliding open with a hiss, revealing a cabin glowing with white light, passengers seated in contoured chairs that shifted to their posture, walls alive with moving images that showed maps and symbols he didn't recognize. Compelled, he took a hesitant step forward, but before he could board, a sudden rush of dizziness overcame him. The lights around him flickered, and with a blink, the futuristic vision was gone, replaced once more by the dimly lit concrete station of 1980s Tokyo, where a rumbling, grimy commuter train screeched to a halt in front of him. Pale and trembling, he boarded without speaking a word, but the memory of that glimpse into the world decades ahead of his own time would haunt him forever, leaving him to wonder if he'd accidentally walked into the Japan of the future. Well, let's go to France. The year is 1914. World War I is raging across the French countryside. Young soldiers separated from his unit near the Marne wandered through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, his rifle clutched tightly as he searched familiar faces in the haze of gunfire. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning powder, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the scarred earth. But as he stumbled over a ridge, he found himself in a silence so profound it made his ears ring. In front of him was a battlefield unlike anything he'd ever seen. Vast craters lit by an eerie orange glow, skies blackened by clouds of smoke that seemed to roll endlessly, and machines of war so massive and terrible they defied belief. Towering metal beasts with armored hulls rolled across the landscape, spitting fire and shells that shattered the ground with thunderous force. Sleek flying craft with no propellers streamed overhead, releasing streaks of light that burned holes in the night sky. Soldiers wearing strange helmets and carrying weapons that spat rapid bursts of flame and light surged forward in coordinated ranks, their voices distorted by metallic masks as they moved through the carnage with terrifying efficiency. Well, this particular soldier dropped to his knees, certain he'd stumbled into a vision of hell itself, but the combatants didn't seem to see him. Passed by as though he was invisible, their faces hidden behind glass visors that reflected only the infernal glow of war. Clutched his cross and prayed, but the vision only grew more violent till a blinding flash of white light engulfed the field. That forced him to cover his own eyes. When he dared to look again, the monstrous machines and futuristic warriors were gone. Once more, he was in the muddy fields of 1914, surrounded by the more familiar horror of bayonets and trenches and artillery. John rejoined his unit, shaken and pale, telling only a few trusted comrades what he'd seen, whispering he had walked into a glimpse of a battle yet to come, wars fought with weapons far beyond their understanding. And though they dismissed him as fevered, he carried with him forever the dreadful certainty that mankind's future held wars even more terrible than the one he was already witnessing. Well, this next story also comes from France. 1935. That year, a middle-aged Parisian businessman, weary after a long day of negotiations, decided to take an evening walk through the winding streets of the left bank. But the past seemed to cling stubbornly to the present in narrow alleys and shadowed courtyards. But as he turned the corner near the Rue de la Harpe, he was seized by a sudden disorienting shift in the very air around him. The gas lamps, usually flickered against the damp stone, were gone, replaced by the dim orange glow of open torches set in iron brackets, the smoke curling upward into a sky free of electric light. Cobblestones beneath his shoes were uneven and slick with mud. The air carried the pungent mix of horse dung and wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Stalls lined the street, piled high with coarse bread and rough cloth and crude metal tools, while men and women in doublets and bodices and rough woolen tunics jostled noisily, speaking in a French so archaic it was nearly incomprehensible to him. He saw beggars with outstretched hands, priests in long robes walking solemnly among the throng, and merchants arguing boisterously in front of taverns whose wooden signs creaked in the wind. Overhead he saw the towers of Notre Dame, yet not blackened by centuries of soot, but fresh and sharp and pale against the night sky, as if newly carved. The businessman's heart pounded as he stumbled forward, the stares of townfolk falling heavily on him, because his tailored suit and polished shoes marked him as impossibly foreign. He felt their murmurs rising like a tide. Panic seized him. He turned back down the alley from which he had entered, and in an instant the torches and the mud were gone. The electric lamps flickered once more, and the traffic in 1930s Paris whirled past as though nothing had happened. He leaned against the walls, trembling, clutching his briefcase like a lifeline. And though he tried to convince himself it was a waking dream brought on by exhaustion, the stench of wood smoke and horse dung seemed to linger in his nostrils, haunting him, reminded that for a brief, impossible moment, he'd walked through the heart of Paris in the 16th century. Well, from Paris, let's go to the U.S. The year is 1969. That year, a young man driving along a remote stretch of highway in Arizona, returning from a late-night visit to a friend's ranch, noticed a strange glow on the horizon. It seemed to pulse an unnatural rhythm. And as he got closer, the air itself seemed to hum with energy. At first, he thought it was a distant neon sign of the headlights of a passing convoy. But then he realized the vehicles ahead were nothing like he'd ever seen before. Sleek, low-slung machines that glided silently along the asphalt, their bodies polished silver and chrome, wheels almost invisible as they hovered slightly above the road. The lights that shimmered in colors beyond the familiar spectrum of red and white. The driver seemed oblivious to his presence, moving in perfect formation, accelerating and braking with impossible precision. Their outlines blurred as if time itself had slowed around them. The hum of their engines, unlike the roar of internal combustion, was a smooth, resonant vibration that he felt in his chest, and the scent of ozone and warm metal filled the night sky. He tried to overtake one of the cars, but as he pressed the accelerator, his own vehicle seemed to resist, as though some invisible force was holding him back. And the futuristic convoy disappeared over a rise, leaving the empty highway bathed in moonlight and an echo of the strange, vibrating hum. Shaken, he continued on his way, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, but there was nothing following him. When he recounted that experience later, friends laughed it off as a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But he never forgot the image of those impossibly advanced vehicles, the sense of speed and precision beyond his time, and the eerie conviction that for a brief stretch of highway in the Arizona desert, he'd seen a glimpse of a future that had not yet arrived. Well, there's been a number of stories coming out of Arizona. That's just one of them. Well, let's go to Mexico, 1978. That year, a young tourist exploring the streets of Mexico City wandered near the historic center, drawn by the vivid colors of murals and lively hum of vendors selling tortillas and spices and hand-carved figurines. And he suddenly felt a strange chill and noticed a bustling crowd parting as though a presence demanded space. Turning, he saw a figure that stopped him in his tracks, a man clad entirely in traditional Aztec warrior garb, his feathered headdress towering above his head, intricate face paint framing eyes that burned with fierce intensity, and a cool strapped to his side, the obsidian blade catching the lights of the afternoon sun. He moved with a fluid grace, stepping over modern cars and pedestrians as though they were shadows, utterly unperturbed by horns or engines, and when he paused, a scent of appalling scents and smoke seemed to cling faintly through the air. The tourist blinked, certain he'd stumbled into a reenactment or a festival. There was no festival, no crowds in costume, only the ordinary city street buzzing with the sounds of 1970s Mexico City. Attempting to approach, he found his legs heavy, but the energy surrounding the warrior was exerting a strange pull. And though he tried to speak, the words caught in his throat. The man stopped briefly, raised his hand in a gesture that seemed ceremonial but commanding, and then continued forward, vanishing into an alley that seemed to lead only to ordinary shops, leaving the tourist standing alone, heart pounding. When he later asked locals about the incident, they shook their heads, some whispering old tales of wandering spirits of Aztec warriors who sometimes appeared to remind the living of their ancestors' power. But nobody could explain why the warrior had walked through the streets of the modern cities as centuries had no meaning, leaving behind only a lingering sense of awe and a faint, lingering scent of ancient incense that seemed impossible to place in time. Well, there's been a number of interesting stories coming out of Mexico City. This is just one of them. Well, let's go to Greece. The year is 1924. That year, a young Greek scholar wandering through the narrow streets of Athens after a late lecture stumbled upon a bustling marketplace tucked between the ruins of ancient temples. At first, he thought it was an ordinary street fair, but as he drew closer, the scene unfolded with a startling authenticity that defied time. Stalls were laden with pottery, fresh fruit, herbs, and woven fabrics. Persons in flowing tunics and sandals shouted prices in a dialect so archaic it made him pause. Their voices carrying over the clatter of wooden carts and the braying of pack animals. The scents of olive oil and fresh bread and roasted meat mingled with the sharp tang of the Aegean air, and above him, the sun glinted off marble columns that seemed freshly carved, their surfaces unmarred by centuries of wear. Citizens moved with a purposeful grace, women carrying water jars on their heads, children chasing each other with sticks and stones, and philosophers or scribes discussing politics in hushed, animated tones beneath the shadows of the Acropolis. Every detail, from the rough-hewn stone streets to the bright dyes of the garments, was impossibly vivid, and the scholar could almost hear the clink of coins and palms and the whisper of scrolls being unrolled for trade. Attempting to call out to a merchant for directions, he found the words met only with polite but puzzled stares, as though he were a stranger in both appearance and speech. Well, panic stirred in him, and when he turned to retrace his steps, the marketplace shimmered and vanished, leaving behind only the quiet, dust-laden streets of 1924 Athens and the faint, lingering scent of bread and herbs in the morning air. Though the scholar later dismissed it to colleagues as a trick of the imagination, never forgot the haunting clarity of walking among the citizens of ancient Athens, a fleeting glimpse of a world long buried but astonishingly alive. Well, from Greece, let's go to Ireland. The year is 1962. That year, a young Irish farmer tending sheep on the mist-shrouded hills of County Kerry wandered near the remnants of an ancient stone circle, where the earth seemed to hum with a presence older than memory. And as twilight descended, he was startled by a soft flickering light emanating from within that circle. When approaching cautiously, he saw a figure emerge, robed in deep green and adorned with intricate symbols carved into wood and bone, holding a shaft that glimmered faintly in the dying light. The druid moved with deliberate grace, chanting in a language that resonated through the mist, vibrating in the air in a way that made the hair on the farmer's arms stand on end. Around that circle, ghostly flames danced without heat, casting long, wavering shadows across the moss-covered stones, while the distant hills seemed to bend inward as if the landscape itself were leaning in to witness the ritual. Farmer's heart pounded, caught between awe and terror, as the druid turned and faced him with piercing eyes that seemed to look not at his body but through him, reading the very pulse of his life. Time itself seemed suspended. The sun had vanished behind the horizon, but darkness hadn't fallen. Only surreal luminous twilight that made every blade of grass, every stone, every swirling mist darkly vivid. When the figure finally raised the staff and the chanting reached a crescendo, a sudden gust of wind scattered the mist, and the druid was gone, leaving the farmer kneeling alone among the cold stones, a scent of herbs and smoke lingering faintly in the air. Trembling, he stumbled home. Though he didn't tell anybody for fear of ridicule, the memory remained incredible. A haunting vision of a Celtic world still alive, whispering secrets from a past that had never truly ended. A moment where the ancient and the present brushed together in impossible clarity. Well, let's talk about the U.S. The year is 1951. That year, a young architect visiting downtown Manhattan late in the evening, his notebook clutched under his arm, went through streets he thought he knew when suddenly came upon a stretch of the city that defied all sense of time. Towering above him were buildings of glass and steel that stretched impossibly into the sky, their surfaces smooth and reflective. Catching the glow of street lights and neon signs didn't exist in his present decade. Bridges and skywalks connected these colossal structures at dizzying heights, and sleek vehicles, silent and gliding as though hovering, moved effortlessly along elevated roadways that crisscrossed the skyline like veins of light. Pedestrians below wore clothes unlike anything he had seen before. Tailored garments that shimmered subtly and fabrics that seemed to shift color with movement. Accessories that emanated soft glows and projected tiny screens of information. Air itself vibrated faintly, filled with a hum that orchestrated through his chest. He could see distant drones or flying machines darting between towers, their trajectories precise and fluid, leaving trails of fluorescent light in their wake. Well, entranced, he wandered through the plazas that were immaculate, lined with vertical gardens and fountains and interactive displays. Nobody seemed to notice his presence. He was a ghost stepping into a vision of a city decades beyond his time. When he tried to sketch the impossibly futuristic skyline in his notebook, the lines blurred and shifted as though resisting permanence. And as the wind gusted through the streets, the towering structures shimmered and melted into the familiar post-war Manhattan of 1951. Elevated roads replaced by scaffolding and brick facades. Silent hover cars replaced by ordinary taxis. He stood rooted to the pavement, his heart pounding, acutely aware he glimpsed a metropolis of the future. City of glass and steel and light that shouldn't have existed in his lifetime. Memory of that impossible vision haunted him for years, a secret dream of what the world might one day become. Well, you never know what you're going to encounter as you wander through some of the highways and byways. And finally, in 1909 Norway, a fisherman navigating the fjords near Bergen set out in a small wooden boat. Chilled Norwegian sea biting through his woolen clothing when a thick rolling mist descended on the water, swallowing the familiar contours of the cliffs and distant lights of the village. And as he rowed cautiously, he noticed shapes emerging from the fog. Long ships, their carved prows adorned with dragon heads, cutting through the water with smooth, silent precision, their oars rising and falling in perfect unison. The men were clad in leather and fur, their helmets gleaming faintly in the muted light. Fisherman blinked, certain his eyes were deceiving him, but the smell of smoke and salt and the creak of timber and muffled voices chanting in a language old and guttural struck him as unmistakably real. Along the shoreline, he glimpsed longhouses with thatched roofs and banners fluttering in the cold wind. Figures moved among them with a purpose, hauling nets and tending fires as though the world had reverted centuries in an instant. His eyes pounded as one of the Viking men turned in his direction, eyes sharp and piercing. But the fisherman felt neither attack nor menace, only a curious awareness he was utterly out of place in this vivid tableau. He tried to low back toward familiar waters, but the mist thickened and the longships gliding around him in the ghostly dance till a sudden gust of wind lifted that fog like a curtain, revealing once more the quiet modern fjord of 1909. We never know what we're going to meet when the fog and the clouds descend. Until tomorrow at this time, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.